Faces of Death Row. True stories from America's most feared prison unit.
Subscribe.
Like. Comment. Because the stories you're about to hear were almost buried forever, and some of the people in them never got a second chance. The rain was still falling when the state trooper found the car abandoned on the shoulder of Highway 17. Engine cold. Driver's door open. Blood smeared across the steering wheel like someone had tried to wipe it away in a hurry. 30 miles south of Charleston, South Carolina. The night smelled of wet asphalt and panic. By dawn, the name Caleb Monroe was on every radio in the county. 24 years old, grocery store clerk, no criminal record, and now the prime suspect in a murder that would place him on death row. The body was discovered hours later in a drainage culvert beneath a collapsed fence. Emily Carter, a local school aide, had been reported missing the previous evening. One gunshot wound. No witnesses. No murder weapon. Just a town desperate for answers and a police department under pressure to deliver one. Detective Harold Vance arrived at the scene with a sinking feeling he'd learned to trust. The evidence didn't line up cleanly. Tire tracks vanished too quickly. Footprints overlapped, muddied by the rain. And yet, within 48 hours, investigators announced they had their man. Caleb Monroe was arrested at his mother's apartment, barefoot, confused, still wearing the same jacket from the night before. The case moved fast. Too fast. A jailhouse informant claimed Caleb confessed during a late-night conversation. A forensic analyst testified that a hair found near the body was a probable match. The jury saw photographs of Emily's smiling face and heard prosecutors describe a senseless act of rage. They never heard about the lost evidence bag. They never heard that the hair analysis method had already been challenged in other states. Caleb insisted on his innocence from the beginning. He told anyone who would listen that he'd panicked because he was scared, not guilty. His court-appointed attorney met with him twice before trial. The verdict took less than 4 hours. Death row swallowed him whole. Behind steel doors and concrete walls, Caleb became one face among hundreds, men condemned by the system, some undeniably guilty, others trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But years later, as a new generation of investigators reopened cold cases across America, one forgotten box from the evidence room resurfaced. Inside it was a sealed envelope. And when they tested what was inside, the results pointed away from Caleb Monroe and directly toward someone the jury had never heard about. The envelope sat on the metal table like a quiet accusation. Inside were swabs taken from beneath Emily Carter's fingernails, collected the night of her autopsy, and never mentioned again. When the lab technician ran the DNA through the national database 2 decades later, the hit came back in under an hour. The profile didn't belong to Caleb Monroe. It belonged to Marcus Hale, a man with a violent history who had lived 3 blocks from Emily and vanished from town a week after her murder. Detective Vance, now retired, was called back into a system he no longer trusted. He stared at the report, feeling the weight of every decision he'd made on that rain-soaked highway. Marcus Hale had been questioned briefly in the original investigation, then released. No follow-up, no paperwork trail explaining why. Just a note scribbled in the margin of a report, not a priority. As the review team dug deeper, more cracks appeared. The jailhouse informant who claimed Caleb confessed had received a reduced sentence days later. The forensic analyst who testified about the hair comparison had since been discredited in 3 other cases. Even the timeline the prosecution built began to collapse when cell phone records, never requested at trial, placed Caleb miles away at the estimated time of death. But the truth didn't move freely. The state fought the appeal aggressively, arguing procedure over justice. Caleb remained on death row, locked in a cell no bigger than a bathroom, counting down appeals instead of days. When Vance visited him for the first time in years, Caleb looked older than his age, his voice steady but worn thin. "They already decided who I was," Caleb said through the glass. "Everything after that was just decoration." Then the case took another turn. 2 weeks after the DNA results surfaced, Marcus Hale was found dead in a cheap motel outside Savannah. Apparent suicide. No note. No fingerprints on the gun. The timing raised alarms among the investigators pushing for Caleb's release. The only living person who could have answered the remaining questions was gone. Files began disappearing from storage. A witness who had recanted her testimony refused to speak again, citing threats she wouldn't describe. Even Vance received an anonymous message warning him to stop digging. The system was closing ranks. As execution dates were quietly discussed behind closed doors, Caleb's attorneys raced against time, filing emergency motions and begging the courts to listen. Outside the prison walls, public attention grew. Protests formed. Journalists started asking the questions no one had asked before. And in the middle of it all was a single, terrifying possibility that the truth had come too late and the state might still carry out a sentence it could never undo. The prison siren wailed at dawn, a low mechanical howl that echoed through concrete corridors like a warning. On death row, every sound carried meaning: doors, footsteps, keys, silence. And on this morning, silence felt heavier than noise. Kayla Monroe's execution date was now official. Outside the prison gates, reporters gathered in clusters, cameras aimed at the razor wire. Protesters held signs with his face printed across them, the words, "DNA doesn't lie," painted in red. Inside, Caleb sat on his bunk, staring at a letter from his mother that he hadn't opened yet. Hope had become something dangerous, something that could hurt worse than despair. Detective Vance and the review team pushed harder, uncovering a shadow network of failures and quiet decisions. A former evidence clerk admitted under oath that boxes had been moved without records during a cleanup operation years earlier. A retired prosecutor revealed that political pressure had driven the department to solve the case fast, before an election. Emily Carter's murder had become less about justice and more about optics. Then another witness surfaced. Rachel Donnelly, a former neighbor of Marcus Hale, contacted a journalist with a confession she had buried for years. She claimed she saw Marcus's car near the drainage culvert the night Emily disappeared. She said she tried to report it, but police never followed up. When investigators finally interviewed her, her hands shook as she spoke, eyes darting to the door. "He saw me," she whispered. "Marcus saw me watching him that night. I knew something was wrong." Hours after her statement was recorded, Rachel's house was broken into. Nothing stolen. Just her front door smashed in, and one message written on the wall in black marker. "Stop talking." Fear spread through the investigation team. Phones were tapped. Files were encrypted. Meetings moved locations. Someone was trying to control the narrative, even now. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Caleb was transferred to an isolation unit. No explanation. No warning. His attorney was denied access for 48 hours. When she finally saw him, he looked thinner, quieter, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're preparing me," he said. "Not for release. For death." But pressure was building beyond the prison walls. National news outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations demanded federal intervention. A motion was filed to halt the execution based on new DNA evidence, witness intimidation, and procedural misconduct. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. 3 days away. 3 days between life and death. And somewhere in the silence between courtrooms, prison walls, and buried evidence, the truth was moving, but not fast enough. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the air conditioning hum when the judge took the bench. No cameras were allowed inside, but the weight of the moment pressed against the walls. Caleb Monroe was brought in wearing shackles, his wrists trembling slightly as he scanned the room. His mother sat in the front row, hands clasped like prayer had become muscle memory. The prosecution spoke first, steady and unapologetic. Procedure. Finality. Closure. They argued the system had worked as designed, even if it wasn't perfect. The defense followed with something harder to dismiss: DNA reports, sworn testimony, records of missing evidence, and the undeniable pattern of shortcuts taken in the rush to secure a conviction. Then the judge asked a single question. Why was this evidence never presented to the jury? No one had a clean answer. By mid-afternoon, the ruling came down. The execution was stayed. Caleb Monroe's conviction was vacated pending a full retrial. A gasp rippled through the room. His mother collapsed into tears. For the first time in 22 years, Caleb felt something close to oxygen return to his lungs. But freedom didn't come with applause. Caleb walked out of prison months later into a world that had moved on without him. His name had once meant killer. Now it meant case. Emily Carter's family refused to speak to him. The state quietly settled a lawsuit without admitting fault. No one was charged for the evidence mishandling. No one apologized on record. The most chilling truth emerged last. A journalist reviewing Marcus Hale's file discovered that his DNA had matched evidence from 2 other unsolved assaults, cases never connected because the samples had never been tested. Hale's suicide was ruled inconclusive after an independent autopsy suggested inconsistencies. No one had bothered to investigate further. Caleb was free, but the real killer had escaped accountability entirely. Years later, Caleb would say the hardest part wasn't death row. It was knowing how close the system came to killing an innocent man, and how easily it could happen again. His story joined dozens of others, faces once hidden behind steel doors, now staring back at a country forced to ask itself an uncomfortable question. How many names were erased before the truth arrived? And how many never got the chance? If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.